The dim light of the storeroom cast long shadows across the shelves, filled with carefully labeled jars of coffee beans. The faint aroma of roasted espresso lingered in the air, a comforting scent that contrasted sharply with the tension brewing inside Tuka Kirishima. She stood near a shelf, one hand cradling her injured arm, wincing as she tried to ignore the pain that throbbed relentlessly. Tuka carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage she applied earlier. Her arm was swollen, with deep bruises forming around the raw cuts left by Mato's Kenkei. She bit her lip, suppressing a hiss of pain as she dabbed at the wound with antiseptic, her movement sharp and unsteady. "Is this different to what I usually have?" the old lady asked Kaneki-kin. "I think I normally have a darker roast." She added, motioning to her coffee, not in an impatient way, but in an unsatisfied manner. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Kaneki said softly and shy. "I'll get you another cup." The woman nodded, and Kaneki walked up the auburn staircase up to the storeroom. Footsteps sounded behind her. "Hey, Tuka!" Kaneki's voice broke the silence as he stepped into the room. He hesitated when he saw her, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she shielded her arm. I was just here to grab some roasted espresso beans. Are they?" Tuka straightened abruptly, her face unreadable, as she pointed to a jar on the shelf. "Over there," she muttered, keeping her tone brisk, as if the act of speaking were an inconvenience. Kaneki moved closer, his eyes flicking to her injured arm. She caught him staring and immediately turned away, reaching up with her good arm to grab the jar of beans. But the sudden stretch sent a sharp, searing pain shooting through her injured arm. Her grip faltered. The jar slipped from her fingers. "Ah!" The jar hit the floor, shattering on impact. Coffee beans scattered everywhere, the sharp clink of glass fragments echoing in the quiet room. Kaneki instinctively bent down to help. "Are you okay?" he asked. He glanced at her arm, noticing the tension in her face and the way she clutched it protectively. "You're hurt, aren't you?" "Let me. I said I'm fine," Tuka snapped, cutting him off sharply. Her tone was defensive, her voice trembling with frustration more than anger. She stepped back, her good hand tightening into a fist. Kaneki hesitated, taken aback. "But leave me alone, Kaneki," she barked, shoving him lightly with her good arm. Her eyes flashed with anger, though there was something deeper hidden behind it. An exhaustion, a vulnerability she refused to let show. "I don't need your help, okay? Just get out." Kaneki opened his mouth to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. There was no reasoning with her like this. Swallowing his words, he nodded reluctantly and stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. Inside, Tuka expressed shakily, her shoulders slumping as the weight of everything pressed down on her. Her gaze fell to the mess of coffee beans and shattered glass on the floor. She clenched her jaw, trying to push down the anger bubbling inside her. The anger at herself for being weak, for getting hurt, for needing help she couldn't bring herself to accept. Alone again, she knelt to start picking up the pieces, her movements slow and deliberate, as if cleaning the mess could somehow make up for everything else that felt broken. Kaneki stood in the quiet of Antaiku's kitchen, leaning against the counter. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound until Yoshimura entered, carrying a tray of freshly cleaned cups. The older man's gaze landed on Kaneki, who seemed lost in thought, his brow furrowed. "Kaneki," Yoshimura began, his voice steady and gentle. "Something on your mind?" Kaneki straightened, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "It's about Tuka," he admitted, his tone uncertain. "She's been distant and hurt, I think." Yoshimura placed the tray on the counter, wiping his hands with the cloth. He nodded slowly. "I assume she's getting herself involved with the Dubs." Kaneki's eyes widened. "You knew?" The manager gave a slight sigh, his face unreadable. "It wasn't hard to guess. Tuka has always been impulsive when it comes to protecting what she values, even if it puts her at risk." Kaneki frowned, leaning forward. But she's been fighting them alone, hasn't she? That's dangerous, and she won't let anyone help her. Yoshimura's gaze softened. But his words remained firm. Since she chose to get involved, she must take responsibility for her actions, whether she lives or dies. It's no one's concern but her own. Kaneki flinched at the bluntness of the statement. How can you say that? He asked, his voice rising slightly. You care about her. I've seen it. How can you act like it doesn't matter? Yoshimura studied Kaneki for a long moment before replying. It's not that it doesn't matter, Kaneki. It's that this is the reality of our world. If we act rashly, we endanger more lives, including hers. Tuka must learn the consequences of her decisions, just as you must learn the weight of yours. Kaneki's fist clenched at his sides. But she's hurting. She won't say it, but she is. And if she's carrying all of that alone, how is she supposed to get through it? Sternly, Yoshimura asserted, I said no. I don't care if she pushes me away, Kaneki said firmly, surprising even himself with his resolve. She shouldn't have to face this by herself. Kaneki knocked lightly on the storeroom door, pushing it open when he heard no response. Inside, Tuka was seated on a wooden stool, her injured arm cradled close to her chest. Her face was pale. Her expression hardened as she glanced up at him. Get out, she said coldly, her tone sharp enough to cut. Kaneki hesitated, taking a step forward instead of leaving. I brought some antiseptic, he said softly, holding up the small kit. You should really treat that wound. Tuka narrowed her eyes. Why are you so irritating? She snapped. A mere human pretending to care, just leave me alone. Kaneki winced at her words but didn't back down. I'm not just human, he replied quietly. I'm part ghoul too, you know that. Tuka let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Part ghoul? Don't kid yourself, you're only pretending to be an ally. You're weak, a coward. Her gaze sharpened as it locked onto him. You had Rise's Kagune. You could have killed the doves in my place, but you didn't. You just stood there. The words stung, hitting Kaneki like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, but found himself speechless. Tuka leaned forward, her eyes blazing with anger. You think you can play both sides? You can't. If you won't fight, then what's the point of you even being here? I don't need your pity. Kaneki clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to meet her gaze. It's not pity, he said firmly. I don't want you to get hurt. Tuka scoffed, looking away. Hurt? I deserve to die, she muttered, her voice breaking slightly. I'm a murderer, Kaneki. You don't get it. I've killed people. That's what ghouls like me do. Kaneki frowned, stepping closer. You don't deserve to die, he said softly, his voice laced with conviction. You're not just a murderer, you're more than that, Tuka. Her laugh was bitter and hollow. Am I? Tell that to Ryoko and Hinami. They were innocent, helpless, and they were killed anyway. Humans don't care if we're good or bad. To them, we're all monsters. Kaneki felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of Anami's tearful cries of Ryoko's sacrifice, of the undeniable cruelty that existed on both sides. Not all humans are like that, he said, though his voice wavered. Just like not all ghouls are killers. I know you don't believe that, but it's true. Tuka's jaw tightened, her anger dimming into something more vulnerable, more raw. She didn't respond, turning her face away from him. I know you're angry, Kaneki continued. His voice was gentle. And I know you're hurting. But pushing everyone away isn't going to make it better. Let me help you, Tuka. Even if it's just this once. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, without looking at him, Tuka muttered, Do whatever you want. Just don't expect me to thank you. Kaneki stepped forward, cautiously, kneeling beside her. As he began to clean her wound, he couldn't help but notice how small her frame seemed, how much weight she was carrying on her shoulders. Tuka remained still, her gaze fixed on a distant point, her walls still firmly in place. But Kaneki didn't mind. For now, being there was enough. Tuka, Kaneki began softly, his voice trembling slightly, but steady enough to carry his resolve. I know you think what you're doing is right, but if you keep going down this path, if something happens to you... Tuka's head whipped around, her sharp eyes narrowing at him. What? You'll be sad? You'll grieve? Is that what you're trying to say? She snapped. Her voice was filled with bitterness, and her injured arm trembled slightly as she spoke. You don't get it, Kaneki. You don't understand what it means to live like this. Kaneki took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Maybe I don't, he admitted. I've only been like this for a short time, but I do know what it's like to lose someone. His voice cracked as he spoke, and he took a hesitant step forward. If something happened to you, Tuka, if you died, I'd grieve. I'd feel the same pain you're trying to bury by pushing everyone away. Tuka flinched, her sharp gaze faltering for a moment. She looked down at her lap, her expression unreadable, though a hint of vulnerability flickered in her eyes. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, Kaneki continued, his voice softening. I don't want to lose you. Not you, not anyone else. Tuka's fingers tightening around the fabric of her skirt. You think I'd care what you feel? She muttered, though her voice lacked the venom it usually carried. Kaneki stepped closer, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. I think you do, he said quietly. And that's why I need your help, Tuka. Teach me how to control my Kagune. Teach me how to stand up against them. Tuka blinked, startled by his sudden request. You, she asked, incredulous. You can barely handle yourself in a fight. What makes you think you can face investigators? Kaneki met her gaze firmly, his determination unshakable. Because doing nothing is worse, he said. I can't just stand by anymore. I can't let people like Ryoko die while I hesitate. I need to learn, Tuka, and you're the only one I trust to teach me. The room fell silent, the weight of Kaneki's words hanging in the air. Tuka studied him for a long moment, her expression a mix of frustration and something softer, something she rarely let show. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh, turning her face away. You're such an idiot, she muttered. Does that mean you'll help me? Kaneki asked, hope flickering in his voice. Tuka didn't answer right away. She stared at the wall, her expression unreadable before finally muttering, Fine, but don't expect me to go easy on you. Kaneki smiled faintly, relief washing over him. I wouldn't want you to. The air grew colder as Kaneki and Tuka descended into the dimly lit underground tunnel. Their footsteps echoed faintly against the damp walls, the scent of earth and stone filling the space around them. Kaneki carried a faint unease as they ventured deeper, his eyes adjusting to the faint light provided by old, flickering bulbs mounted sporadically along the ceiling. So, Kaneki began hesitantly, his voice breaking the silence. Hanami, she stays at Entaiku now, doesn't she? Tuka glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Yeah, she replied shortly, keeping her gaze ahead. Kaneki lowered his head, his thoughts drifting to the young girl. I wonder, does she sleep well at night? He murmured, more to himself than to Tuka. Tuka's steps faltered her for a fraction of a second before she continued walking. Probably not, she said bluntly, her voice carrying a tinge of bitterness. How could she? Her mom's gone. She's stuck in this messed up world. That kind of thing doesn't just go away. Kaneki frowned, guilt gnawing at him as her words sunk in. He wanted to say something, but the weight of the truth silenced him. As they continued walking, Kaneki glanced around at the tunnel's rugged walls, noting how the passage seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. "This place," he said, trailing off before speaking again. "Why does it look like this? It's eerie." Tuka smirked faintly, though her eyes remained focused ahead. "The ghouls of Tokyo built it a long time ago," she explained. "Back when humans started getting better at hunting us, it was a way to isolate ourselves, a place where they couldn't follow." Kaneki's brows furrowed as he took in her words. "So, this whole pathway was made by ghouls?" "Yeah," Tuka confirmed, her tone matter of fact. "It's a network that runs all through the city, but it's not exactly friendly. If you don't know where you're going, you could get lost." Kaneki slowed his pace slightly, staring into the shadowed corners of the tunnel. "Lost?" he echoed, his voice tinged with unease. Tuka shrugged, her expression casual but her voice firm. "It goes deeper than you'd think. There are places down here where even ghouls won't go." A shiver ran down Kaneki's spine as he glanced over his shoulder, imagining the labyrinth pathways sprawling beneath Tokyo. The idea of a world hidden beneath the city, carved out of necessity by ghouls seeking refuge, was both fascinating and unsettling. Tuka seemed unfazed, her pace steady as she led the way. "You're not scared, are you?" she asked, glancing back at him with a faint smirk. Kaneki straightened up, shaking his head quickly. No, of course not, just curious." "Good," Tuka said, turning her gaze forward again. "Because we're not here to sightsee. You wanted to learn how to fight, so get ready." Kaneki's nerves were already frayed as he and Tuka stopped in the open space of the underground tunnel. The faint light from the ceiling barely illuminated the area, casting long shadows that danced around them. He wiped his palms on his pants, trying to calm the growing sense of dread gnawing in his stomach. Tuka stretched her arms and cracked her neck, her expression as sharp as a blade. "All right," she said, her voice steady and cool. "Let's get started." Kaneki blinked, taking a hesitant step back. "Get started with what?" "With teaching you, obviously," she replied, smirking slightly. "But fair warning, you might die in the process." His heart skipped a beat as he stared at her, wide-eyed. "Die?" "Yeah," Tuka said bluntly, crouching slightly as if ready to pounce. "You wanted to learn, didn't you? So stop whining and take it seriously." Before Kaneki could respond, Tuka lunged forward, her speed nearly blinding. Her fist slammed into his gut, the force of it sending him stumbling backward as the air was knocking from his lungs. Kaneki barely had time to recover before Tuka closed the distance again, swinging her fist with precision and speed. His instincts kicked in, and he managed to dodge the first few blows, his movements clumsy, but effective enough to avoid getting hit. "You've got decent reflexes," Tuka muttered, her tone almost begrudging, "but that's not enough." With the swift motions, he sent Kaneki crashing into the ground. The impact left him dazed, his head spinning as he tried to push himself up. But before he could fully regain his senses, Tuka yanked off his eye patch, exposing his ghoul eye. Kaneki flinched, his hand instinctively reaching up to cover it, but Tuka didn't seem fazed. Instead, she crouched beside him, her expression unreadable as she studied his face. "You're not even mad, are you?" she said, her voice low. "I just knocked you around, ripped off your eye patch, and you're still sitting there, looking like a lost puppy." Kaneki didn't respond, his breathing heavy as he stared at her. Tuka's lips curled into a bitter smirk. "Fine, let's see how far you're willing to go." Before Kaneki could react, she grabbed his hand and placed her boot over his index finger. His eyes widened in alarm as she applied pressure, bending the finger back slowly. "Wait, Tuka!" With a sharp snap, the finger broke and Kaneki let out a cry of pain. "That's more like it," Tuka said, her voice cold. "You think you could survive as a ghoul by holding back? By being soft? You'll die faster than you can blink." Kaneki clutched his injured hand, his face contorted in pain. But even through the agony, he looked up at Tuka, his eyes filled with determination. I don't want to fight like this," he said through gritted teeth, "but I'll do whatever it takes to protect the people I care about." even if it means getting hurt. Tuka's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her face. She stood up, taking a step back. "Then prove it," she said quietly, turning away. "Get up, Kaneki. Show me you're not just some weakling pretending to play the part of a ghoul." Tuka folded her arms, her sharp eyes fixed on Kaneki as he struggled to catch his breath. The faint glow of the underground tunnel cast her figure in shadows, giving her a commanding presence. She didn't look like she was done yet, not even close. "You still standing?" she asked, her tone icy but tinged with impatience. "Good, because here's another warning for you." She tilted her head slightly, her expression darkening. "This time you might actually die." Kaneki's heart pounded in his chest. He wiped sweat from his forehead, his instinct screaming at him to run. But instead of retreating, he gritted his teeth and braced himself, his body tense and ready. Tuka took a step forward, signaling an even more intense move to come. Her movements were deliberate, almost predatory. The air around her seemed to hum with the tension. In a split second, Kaneki realized he had no choice. His fingers curled into fist, and with a burst of determination, he activated his Kagune. It sprang forth in a sudden visceral motion, dark and sinuous, swaying like a serpent behind him. Tuka paused mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she studied the shape of his Kagune. Her expression shifted, curiosity flickering beneath her stern demeanor. "That's it," she said, almost disappointed. "The Kagune you used on Nishiki was way more powerful than this." Kaneki's jaw tightened. I don't know how to control it yet," he admitted, his voice strained. Tuka circled him, her gaze appraising. "It's different," she murmured, more to herself than him. "The shape isn't the same as before." She stopped, pointing at the writhing appendage. "You're a Renkaku type, just like Riz." Kaneki blinked, startled by the observation. "Renkaku?" Tuka nodded. "Let's go back upstairs." When upstairs, she began to explain. "Renkaku ghouls are strong. You heal quickly, and your tenacity is better than any other type. If you can figure out how to use it properly, you'll be able to dominate both defensively and offensively." Kaneki swallowed hard, glancing at his Kagune. It still felt alien to him, an unwieldy extension of his body. "But I can't control it," he admitted. "Sometimes it doesn't even come out when I need it most." "That's because you're weak," Tuka said bluntly. She tapped her foot against the ground, her gaze unwavering. "And if you stay weak, you're going to die. But there's a way to fix that." Kaneki looked at her, his expression a mix of uncertainty and hope. "Well, then how?" Tuka crossed her arms again, her voice firm. "Training. You need to strengthen your body. If you can't rely on your Kagune in close combat, then you better make sure you're strong enough to hold your own without it." "What kind of training?" Kaneki asked hesitantly. "Athletic exercises, physical activities, anything that pushes your body past its limits." Tuka said, "You've got Riz's Kagune, which means you've got her strength. But if you don't know how to use it, then it's wasted on you." Kaneki nodded slowly, her voice sinking in. He glanced down at his Kagune, again its movements erratic and uncontrolled. He clenched his fist, determination hardening in his eyes. "I'll do it," he said firmly. Tuka smirked faintly, the corners of her lips curving upward. "Good," she said, "because if you don't, I'm not going to waste my time teaching you anymore. You don't look like you've ever lifted anything heavier than a book," she said, tugging at his shirt for emphasis. "How do you expect to survive with a physique like this? Pathetic." Her bluntness stung, but Kaneki didn't respond. He looked down, feeling a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Training sounded grueling, and his body still caught between human frailty and ghoul resilience. It seemed so far from the strength she was demanding. Before he could form a reply, a voice interrupted the tension. Well, what a lively little scene." Both Kaneki and Tuka turned to see Uda, standing casually in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with his usual enigmatic smile. holding a small package in one hand. "What are you doing here?" Tuka asked, narrowing his eyes. Uta stepped into the room with an air of calm detachment, as if he hadn't just walked in on a heated moment. "Just stopped by to drop something off," he said smoothly, holding up the package. Kaneki's mask. Kaneki blinked in surprise. "My mask?" Uta nodded, stepping closer. He placed the package in Kaneki's hands and motioned for him to open it. Kaneki hesitated before unwrapping it, revealing the sleek, black leather mask inside. "It's different," Kaneki murmured, running his fingers over the material. Uta tilted his head slightly, his grin widening. I made a little adjustment. The eye patch covers the right side instead of the left now." Kaneki looked up, puzzled. "Why?" "Because," Uta replied, his tone light yet teasing. "I wanted to see the eye you usually keep hidden. It's always the things we try to conceal that are the most interesting, don't you think?" Tuka rolled her eyes, crossing her arms again. "You're such a creep," she muttered. Uta chuckled, unbothered by the remark. "Call it a artistic curiosity," he said with a shrug. His gaze shifted back to Kaneki. "Try it on, let's see how it looks." Kaneki hesitated but eventually lifted the mask, fitting it over his face. The leather hugged his skin snugly, and the single exposed eye felt strangely vulnerable. "Perfect," Uta said, nodding in approval. "Now you look the part." Kaneki lowered the mask. His expression conflicted. He wasn't sure how to feel about being made to look more like a ghoul, but something in Uta's words lingered in his mind. "Thanks," Kaneki said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Uta waved off the gratitude with a lazy motion. "Think nothing of it, just make sure you put it to good use." As Uta turned to leave, Tuka glanced back at Kaneki, her earlier scorn replaced with a faint look of curiosity. "If you're serious about training," she said, her voice softer than before, "you'll need that mask soon enough. Don't waste what you've been given." Kaneki nodded, gripping the mask tightly. Her words weren't exactly encouraging, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about proving to himself that he could face whatever lay ahead. The air felt thick with exhaustion as Kaneki wiped the sweat from his brow, his attempts to control his kagune once again falling short. His body was sore, the muscles straining from the repeated motions, but no matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed to improve. Tuka crossed her arms and watched him with a slight frown. "What's your deal, Kaneki?" she asked, a hint of irritation in her voice. "You're still relying on sugar cubes for substance. You're not going to get anywhere like that." Kaneki paused, his breath shallow as he lowered his kagune. "I can't help it," he murmured. "I'm still adjusting. It's hard to get used to this side of me." Tuka sighed, pushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "You need real food. Not just sugar, it's not just about fighting. You have to take care of yourself." Kaneki shifted uncomfortably. "I know. I'm trying." "Yeah, well, you're not trying hard enough," Tuka said, her tone sharp, but not without a touch of concern. "Look, we'll train again tomorrow after work, but today, follow me. I'm taking you somewhere." Kaneki raised an eyebrow. "Where?" Tuka turned away, her eye back to him as she started walking. "You'll see. Just meet me at my school after it lets out. I've got something planned for you." The day dragged on for Kaneki, his thoughts returning to the cryptic words from earlier. What could Tuka possibly have in mind for him? But as the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Kaneki found himself standing by the school gates, waiting. Soon enough, Tuka emerged, her usual confident stride set firmly as she approached him. She had 2 bags in one hand, one slung over her shoulder, the other held tightly in her grip. She walked up to him without a word, her expression unreadable. "Here," she said simply, tossing one of the bags to Kaneki. "Change into this." Kaneki blinked in surprise. The bag felt heavy in his hands and he opened it, revealing the black male school uniform inside. His mouth went dry. "Wait, you want me to wear this?" he asked, his voice incredulous. Tuka raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what's the matter? You too good to wear a school uniform? Kaneki chuckled nervously. It feels like cosplaying or something. Tuka shot him a pointed look, then grinned, her eyes narrowing. Well, if that's how you feel, I'll just have to make sure you really feel it. Without warning, she stepped closer and ruffled his hair, messing it up as she tugged and pulled. There, perfect, and you can't forget this. She took his eye patch from his pocket and carefully placed it on his face, adjusting it until it was snug. Kaneki was left speechless as she stepped back and eyed him critically. The school uniform fit awkwardly on him, the sleeves a little too tight, the collar a little too stiff. But more than that, there was something strangely surreal about being dressed as a normal student again. Something that made the entire situation feel all the more bizarre. See, Tuka said, tilting her head as she appraised him. Now you look like you belong here. Kaneki adjusted the collar uncomfortably, his fingers brushing against the fabric. This feels strange, he admitted. Tuka smirked, clearly enjoying his discomfort. Good, now let's go. We've got work to do. She turned on her heel and began walking, and Kaneki followed suit, still feeling the weight of the uniform pressing on him. He wasn't entirely sure what the plan was, but with Tuka leading the way, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Kaneki's heart raced as they approached the imposing building of the Commission of Counter Ghoul headquarters. The tall structure loomed ahead, an austere symbol of the organization's power and reach. As he stood there, Kaneki could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him, suffocating him. Tuka, however, seemed unbothered by the looming presence of the CCG. She strode forward, her footsteps purposeful, and turned to Kaneki with a sharp look. We're going inside, she said, her voice firm. Kaneki hesitated, his hand faltering as he gripped from the strap of his bag. Wait, you're not serious, are you? This is the enemy's base. If we get caught... Tuka didn't wait for him to finish. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the entrance. You think I'm playing around? We're doing this. Now move. Before Kaneki could protest further, she had dragged him inside, her strength belying the delicate appearance she often portrayed. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the headquarters hit him immediately. Everything inside was sleek and meticulously organized, from the polished floors to the bright overhead lights that seemed to shine a little too harshly. Tuka led him down a long corridor, and as they turned a corner, Kaneki's eyes caught sight of a large screen board mounted on the wall. The display was covered with posters, wanted notices of various schools. His stomach twisted as he took in the faces staring back at him, each one accompanied by a reward for information leading to their capture. His eyes darted over the familiar faces. Tsukiyama's smug smile grinned back at him. Riz Kamashiro's elegant, haunted beauty was immortalized, and beneath it, the name of Hanami Fuegachi, the girl he had grown so fond of, was displayed with a cold, calculating efficiency. His stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. See that? Tuka's voice broke through the windows, her tone flat. They're after all of us, but we're not here to get caught. We're here to gather information. Kaneki nodded, but the words still hung heavy on his chest. But Tuka, this is risky. What if... Stop thinking so much, she snapped, her sharp gaze cutting through him. If we want to survive, we need to know what they know. And if we're going to stay one step ahead, we need to get inside their heads. We're going to do this as students from Shuyu High School. Got it? Kaneki swallowed, the tension in his chest tightening. He wasn't sure what terrified him more. The idea of being inside the CCG headquarters, or just the thought of playing the part of a student infiltrator. But before he could protest further, Tuka was already heading toward the reception desk. They approached the counter where a bored-looking receptionist barely glanced up at them as they approached. Can I help you? The receptionist asked, her tone flat. Tuka didn't hesitate. We're here to fill out some forms, she said, her voice steady as she slid a paper toward the receptionist. We're students from Shuyu High School. We need access. Kaneki almost recoiled at the thought of pretending to be someone else, especially a high school student, but he simply followed Tuka's lead. When the receptionist handed them a clipboard, Kaneki looked down at the form. His name was supposed to be Kanemoto, and it felt strange writing it down. As they filled out the forms, Kaneki couldn't help but glance around nervously. The room was quiet, and the only sounds were the scribbling of pens and the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. His palms felt clammy, and his mind raced. What if they were caught? What if they were too late? The fear gnawed at him, but Tuka remained unnervingly calm beside him. As they sat in the waiting area, filling out the required paperwork, the voices of two investigators drifted toward them. Kaneki tensed, his voice skipping a beat. You hear about the gourmet? One investigator asked, his voice low and hushed. The other investigator snorted in reply. Yeah, case 696, right? Real headache. Someone needs to take care of that mess. It's getting out of hand. Not to mention the gourmet's connections. The first investigator replied, his voice carrying just enough for Kaneki to catch the hint. If we don't get a handle on it soon, we'll have a bigger problem than just the usual ghoul hunts. Kaneki's eyes flicked up toward the platform above them as they made their way deeper into the CCG headquarters. A strange, ominous structure stood there, something that he hadn't noticed before. It looked like a large, metallic gate, surrounded by wires and flashing lights. The moment his gaze settled on it, he felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. What's that? He pointing towards the gate. Some kind of scanner? Tuka's gaze followed his, and she gave a short, almost amused snort. You're quick to notice things, she said, though her tone held no warmth. She glanced back at him, her eyes cold and calculating. That's the RC scan gate. It's designed to detect ghouls by scanning the RC cell readings. Kaneki's brows furrowed in confusion. RC cells? What does that mean exactly? Tuka glanced at him, her expression softening slightly but her voice remaining level. Ghouls have RC cells in their bodies. Different from humans, that's what powers our kagune, our abilities. The RC scan gate detects those cells, so if a ghoul passes through it, the gate picks up the readings and instantly flags them. Kaneki's stomach churned as he processed the information. A gate that could detect ghouls instantly. It sounded terrifyingly efficient. So if we were to walk through that thing, it'd know we're ghouls. Tuka nodded, her expression darkening. Exactly. But don't get too comfortable. It's not fully functional yet. She paused, casting a look toward the gate as though weighing its potential. The CCG ran out of money before they could complete the engineering on it. Kaneki raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected flaw in their otherwise well-maintained facility. What do you mean? You think something so important would have been prioritized? Tuka's lip curled into a grim smile. The CCG's resources are stretched thin. They get money for a lot of things, but not everything gets the funding it needs. The gate's still a prototype. It can't detect ghouls unless they're right in front of it. And even then, it only works sporadically. They were supposed to roll it out across all the districts, but without enough money, it's just sitting here, gathering dust. Kaneki frowned. So, if it were finished, ghouls would be easily caught. Exactly, Tuka confirmed, her eyes narrowing as she thought about the implications. If they ever complete it, these gates could be set up all over the world. Ghouls wouldn't be able to hide anywhere. They'd be forced to retreat even deeper into the underground, cut off from the world they've been trying to survive in. A heavy silence between them as Kaneki processed that Tuka had said. The weight of the situation dawned on him more clearly now. The future of ghouls, of people like him, could hinge on a technology that was still in its infancy. A gate like that could force entire communities of ghouls into hiding, making them even more vulnerable. He looked up at the unfinished gate once more, his mind racing with the thought of what might happen if it were completed. If it were implemented on a larger scale, this could change everything, Kaneki murmured, more to himself than to Tuka. Tuka's eyes followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. Yeah, she said softly, it could. Kaneki and Tuka, dressed in their school uniforms as part of their disguise, moved cautiously through the CCG headquarters. Tuka, her expression as cold as ever, led the way with purposeful steps while Kaneki tried his best to keep his nerves in check. The feeling of walking straight into the heart of the enemy's base, dressed as an ordinary student, weighed heavily on him, but he kept his mouth shut, trusting that Tuka had a plan. As they entered the lobby, a cheerful voice cut through the tension. A woman with a friendly smile approached them. Kaneki couldn't help but notice how odd it was for someone from the enemy side to be so upbeat. "Hello, you two must be the new students. Welcome to the CCG," she said, her tone far too bright for the circumstances. Kaneki glanced at Tuka, who gave him a quick, barely noticeable nod. The woman, who introduced herself as Usawa, the head of information, continued speaking, though her overly sunny disposition seemed at odds with the grim situation. "I'm sure you're here to gather information, right?" She beamed at them as if they were nothing more than ordinary students at a field trip. Kaneki, still uneasy, took the details of the room. Despite Usawa's cheery facade, everything about the CCG felt sterile, cold and calculating. His heart raced as they moved deeper into the building, following Usawa toward a large screen board filled with unwanted posters of ghouls. Tsukiyama, Riz, Kamishiro, and Hinami Fuegichi were among the many faces staring back at them. Tuka was the first to speak, her voice flat and controlled. "I saw a ghoul near Kazuhara Elementary School along the riverside in the 20th Ward," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke. Kaneki's heart skipped a beat at her mention of the location, and he couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. The way Tuka described the ghoul's clothing made him suspect it was Hinami. The implications of spreading false information could be dangerous, but Tuka seemed unfazed. Usawa listened intently, nodding. "That's a good lead," she said with a smile that seemed a little too eager. "As for the ghoul investigators, they're on the lookout in that area. They've been working the 20th Ward recently." Kaneki shifted slightly, trying to calm his nerves as Usawa's words sank in. The CCG was after Hinami, and the thought of them tracking her down while they were here felt like a heavy weight on his chest. Then out of nowhere, Tuka dropped another question. "Do ghoul investigators ever use handguns?" she asked, her voice casual but carrying a sharp edge beneath the surface. Usawa didn't skip a beat. "It's supposed to be a kept secret," she replied, her tone dropping slightly as though the question had piqued her curiosity. "But yes, they do. It's a specialized tool for certain situations." Kaneki tensed. The idea of investigators having access to such weapons was unsettling, but Usawa's next words sent a shiver down his spine. "Right now, there are 2 investigators working in the 20th Ward," she said, almost to herself. "They've already killed Ryoko Fuegichi and are searching for her daughter Hinami. It's all part of their plan to wipe out the ghouls here." Tuka's expression hardening at the mention of Ryoko, but she said nothing. Kaneki felt a surge of guilt in his chest. He had known and he hadn't been able to stop it. The weight of the investigation, of Hinabi's safety, pressed heavily on him. Usawa's attention shifted back to them, her gaze lingering for a moment, longer than it should have. "Anything else you need?" she asked with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Tuka's expression tightened as Usawa spoke, her words casually dismissing the lives of innocent ghouls. "Killing a child, even an innocent one, is heartbreaking," Tuka murmured, her voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of anger. Usawa, however, remained unshaken. "Ghouls are not human," she replied dismissively, her tone laced with conviction. "They're a threat to the human race. Destroying them is necessary. It's the only way to ensure humanity's survival." Tuka bit her lip, holding back the sharp retort that threatened to slip out. She had heard this rhetoric before, but hearing it from someone so close to the enemy made the words feel more venomous. The callousness with which Usawa spoke about the death of a child, it wasn't just a difference of perspective, it was the stark reality of how the CCG viewed ghouls. Kaneki's heart raced, his stomach tightening. With the weight of the conversation, but he stayed quiet. Watching the exchange unfold, there was no room for doubt in Usawa's mind. She truly believed in the righteousness of the CCG's cause, and that made her all the more dangerous. The tension between them hung in the air as they made their way toward the exit, but just as they neared the door, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Before they could react, Tuka accidentally bumped into someone, causing a sharp jolt of pain to shoot through her injured shoulder. She winced, quickly pulling back. Kaneki's eyes widened in alarm, but before either of them could recover, a voice rang out from behind them. "Hey, watch where you're going!" It was Kiryu Mato, his voice dripping with suspicion as he eyed Tuka with narrowed eyes. His gaze flickered briefly to Kaneki, but it was clear he was focused on her. Tuka, her face turning slightly pale, shifted away from them, trying to appear as innocent as possible, but her discomfort was palpable. "Sorry, we didn't mean to," she began, but Mato wasn't having it. No, I'm not letting this go," he cut her off sharply. His keen investigator instincts were already on high alert. "You two are high school students, right? Just here to share information, is that it?" He took a step closer, his piercing gaze locking onto them, making the air feel thick with tension. "Then why don't you tell me exactly what you're up to?" Kaneki's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. They hadn't expected to run into someone like Mato here. The more he looked at the sharpness in Mato's eyes, the more he realized how dangerously close they were to being caught in a lie. Tuka hesitated for a moment, her fingers twitching as she fought against the urge to flee. The idea of being exposed to someone like Mato made her skin crawl, but she knew better than to show any weakness now. She met Mato's gaze, her expression hardening, and for a brief moment she held his stare with a quiet, unwavering intensity. "I'm telling you, we're just students," she said coolly, though the hint of tension in her voice betrayed her. "We were just gathering information, that's all. We didn't mean any harm." Mato didn't seem convinced, his brow furrowing as he studied her closely. "You're hiding something," he muttered, his tone sharpening. "Tell me everything. I won't ask again." Kaneki's palms began to sweat, his body stiffening as he prepared for what might come next. The last thing they needed was Mato's suspicion turning into something more dangerous. He glanced at Tuka, whose jaws was clenched in frustration, and knew she wasn't going to give in easily. But just how far would she go to keep their cover intact? And what would happen if Mato pressed too hard?